On April 2nd of 2025, Donald Trump points a gun at the world economy.
I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world.
It wasn't just a policy shift, it was a message that America demanded fairness. But there was more to it beneath the surface. Soon after, every country was pulled into the chaos, but America had one main target. They say no one wins in a trade war, but that's wrong. Because what most don't realize is that this war isn't just about trade. Instead, it's a high-stakes gamble on who will write the rules for years to come. And to answer who'll win, we have to look back at the warning that history left us. In the 1930s, America raised tariffs during the Great Depression to try and save their economy, and other countries quickly retaliated. Trade collapsed, and soon after, so did the markets. Instead of helping, it ended up making the worst depression in history even worse. So it's important that you understand that there's stakes to a trade war. It can lead to wins, but a lot of times big losses. Since then, the US learned its lesson and actually started flipping strategies to what we see today, free trade. We built global alliances, opened up trade, and made the dollar the world's trade and reserve currency, which gave tremendous power to the US since now global trade had to flow through America. But this victory created two big problems that explain why the US is now fighting against the very system that we created. First, other countries started playing the game differently. Since everyone wanted to sell to America and get these US dollars, and America wanted to consume, they started flooding America with their cheaper products. But at the same time, they made it harder for American products to enter their markets. And this is exactly what created the trade deficits that Trump calls unfair. But here's a twist. The strong dollar is a double-edged sword. It gives America global influence, but it's also the exact thing making the US goods too expensive to buy for other countries. So to compete, US companies started moving jobs overseas to find cheaper labor. And just like that, the US stopped making things. Which brings us to today, Liberation Day 2025. Trump's team says that they're motivated by this threat of deindustrialization, but the bigger reason wasn't economic, but security. Because guess which country has now become the world's new factory? Liberation Day isn't really about making trade fair. It's a global attack disguised to hit China. That's why tariffs against them are now up to 245%. That's why loopholes that China previously exploited through our neighboring allies like Mexico were closed off with these record tariffs against them. America is trying to do three things at once: make things again, keep the dollar strong, and above all, contain China's rise that the US views as a threat to it all. I spent weeks following the moves that both China and the US are making, and what I found is that the global balance may already be shifting. Because in this high-stakes game with your future on the line, who will walk away richer and who will lose it all?
US stocks are tumbling. The Dow is already down. Retaliation from China. President Trump's escalating trade war.
It'll be something the whole world will be talking about it.
But before we get into the power games that each country is playing, in a world where narrative is power, how you tell your story matters just as much as the story itself. And it's exactly why I use my sponsor, Opus Clip, to create my shorts and clips on my second channel. AI-powered Clip Anything feature allows me to just copy and paste my video URL, and it creates the most viral clips for me. And with their Reframe Anything feature, it adjusts framing and movement and resizes the video to fit any social platform with just one click. In fact, there's a good chance that's maybe how you even know me, because these shorts from this video went pretty viral. But now I can focus my time making the best videos on long form instead of spending hours on making clips that are very important for reach. So use my link in the description to get 50% off for 3 months with Opus Clip. So back to the video. So what exactly is China's strategy to climb to the top? And I think the best way to compare their strategy to ours is by using books. Trump literally wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, where he outlines power through bold leverage and unpredictability. While China's modern strategy often also follows ideas from a book called The Art of the War, which was written by Sun Tzu, an ancient Chinese general who believed in winning through patience, deception, and psychological warfare. And I think these approaches says a lot about both cultures. And so to better understand this, I talked to two experts with unexpected perspectives. A white guy who's pro-China and a Chinese guy who's anti-China.
Yeah, so I host a YouTube program called China Insider with David Zhang, and basically I cover some of the stuff that Chinese state media and basically what doesn't get talked about when it comes to China.
My name is Cyruss Jansen. I am a geopolitical analyst that makes videos primarily about China. None is more important right now than the absolute global trade war that is involving every country in the world and what Donald Trump is doing in the United States.
And to kick this off, I wanted to start with arguably one of the most powerful weapons in any trade war, soft power, or a country's ability to influence others through culture or media. And I think it's something that Trump understands too well. Perfect example is what he tweeted in 2018, that trade wars are good and easy to win. It's a perfect example of him using something that he's used throughout his entire career, and that's to control the narrative. Because even though that statement obviously isn't true, it doesn't really matter. Because in the political theater that is a trade war, what matters more is who can control the perception first. And I don't think there's a better example than TikTok.
I think what's been incredible is, with Donald Trump really wanting to attack TikTok and potentially ban that, what you've seen in the United States is you've seen millions of Americans actually leave and actually go to another Chinese app called Xiaohongshu. They've started to see what the real China is like. And many Americans, and I'm talking millions of Americans, have been exposed to, wow, what the United States government and my media is telling me in the United States is very different than what's on the ground and what's really happening in China. And I think that's a huge soft power win for China here in 2025.
Interesting. Do you think this was a concerted effort from the Chinese government, or the fact that it was more so the undoing of the American government for trying to ban an app that's I guess one of the most popular apps around the world and the United States?
Oh, it's absolutely has nothing to do with the Chinese government. That's the most amazing thing about it, right? Is that China got a huge win by literally sitting back and doing nothing, because it wasn't China saying, hey, come and download this new app. Why don't you guys come over here? It really was Americans frustrated by this attack on the freedom of speech. What we're also seeing, Jen, is we're seeing international tourism to China is absolutely skyrocketing right now in 2025, which is actually quite the opposite, because actually tourism to the United States is absolutely on a free fall decline right now, specifically because of this Trump trade war.
I think a lot of people write off soft power because they don't understand how powerful it is. Perception shapes almost everything that we do. And as Cyruss mentioned, if perceptions are shifting, it can drive actions beyond tourism. Just look at when iShowSpeed recently streamed from China to 37 million followers. And yes, sure, that tour was probably curated by the government, but when someone that big shows a different side of a country that Americans are usually distrustful of, it absolutely impacted how a lot of young Americans are gonna look at China today and in the future. But speed isn't the only example. China isn't just inviting US creators in, they're now making the content themselves.
China, China, China. Nadie sabe de toreros como yo.
This Birkin bag at Hermes Boutique will cost you 38,000 USD.
From probably the funniest marketing I've ever seen to viral exposés of American brands and their markups, they're actively flipping the narrative one clip at a time. And I know it's hard to conceptualize how a clip can change perception and how this relates to a trade war, but there's a reason why this has become more of a recent strategy for China to also control the narrative. And it's because it also aligns with their principles. Because for China, the goal isn't to just make Americans obey, it's to make them question their own government's narrative against China. Because it aligns with a core idea from The Art of War. The greatest victory requires no battle. Now look, I'm American, not a Chinese spy, but credit where credit is due. China's soft power strategy is impressive and it's starting to work. And I'm definitely not the only one who's noticed. So I asked David, who closely tracks China, who's really winning the soft power war? Is there a unique advantage for the Chinese side in the fact that they are able to, release on American platforms versus vice versa, America not being able to post on Chinese platforms?
America, in that sense, is an open book. Its flaws are revealed publicly. In China, the benefit of having that state apparatus is that you can really hide what you don't want to talk about. You can amplify what you do want to talk about. There pro-China channels can be on YouTube and other social media platforms. But if the same things are being talked about from, say, an American person or uploaded onto Chinese social media, including Chinese video platforms, those will get censored. It's very beneficial for creating an image of China that they want to portray. Whereas in America, you have even the media in America criticizing America. So that creates this idea that it almost feels like America is extremely flawed, that it has no positives to it.
For decades, America's biggest advantage can be argued as its military and its economy, but I think it's been its media. From Hollywood to music to tech, and just like we saw on Liberation Day, it's not just telling the story, it's making sure the world heard it first. And the reason why we use the same playbook over and over again is because it's effective. Since the announcement, over 50 countries, including trade-heavy nations like India and Vietnam and allies like Canada and Mexico, have started to renegotiate or boost imports with the US. And I think that's where China still falls short and where the US still leads, because there's a big difference between controlling what your people hear and controlling what the world believes. America's story machine works globally, and China isn't there yet. But the problem is, that machine is starting to break. Because after the initial chaos, now the panic is starting to set in the US. And as China and the US has escalated to fighting fire with fire, it's gone beyond just media games and now has escalated to the game of money. If that's the case, who has more to lose? Because I think when it comes to power games, right, I think the side that needs the other less usually has the big advantage, the big leverage. Who has more to lose in this trade war? Is it China with its export-dependent economy or America with its consumer-driven market?
Yeah, it's definitely China in my opinion, because let's first talk about the American side. Obviously, we're very reliant on Chinese products. There's no other way around it. But ultimately, this is a short-term problem because Americans they have choices that they can do. Maybe the price is a little bit higher, but these type of things, they have to sort them out. Or say a shirt used to be made in China, now it's made in Bangladesh or Vietnam. Those type of situations are going to be a little bit strange for Americans, but over time it's going to change. But then you look at on the scale of what Chinese people are going through is that they're losing jobs. I've seen videos recently where the factories lose money by running the machine, so they rather not do so and take a holiday sort of break to, until things settle down. And also if you look at what China buys from America, these are a lot of things, include chips, medical equipment, technology-based things, service-based things. And those things are going to get really expensive for the Chinese consumers or even businesses.
And in this power game of money, the US is using its biggest weapon, control over the world's richest market. Even with a quarter of China's population, Americans still outspend over 1 billion Chinese people combined. And it's why every country wants access to US consumers. And this control over the market and having the world's currency is the leverage that the US is maximizing like a credit card. But just like a credit card that you overuse, it's starting to reach a limit. Because China's retaliation is not just inviting political pressure from other countries, it's starting to come from within.
Donald Trump comes out and he absolutely slams 145% tariffs on China. Now, within a couple of days, he automatically starts to walk back from this. And he says, okay, we're going to have to give an exemption to what? Well, we need to give an exemption to computers, monitors, cell phones, smartphones. I guarantee you that Tim Cook from Apple gave a call right to the White House and said, you are committing economic suicide. Tim Cook gave an announcement or an interview, and he said,
the popular conception is that companies come to China because of low labor costs. I'm not sure what part of China they go to, but the truth is China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago.
I think the general rule when it comes to power is like the side that needs the other less often has more leverage. Who do you think has more to lose in this trade war? Is it China with its export-dependent economy or America with its consumer-driven market?
Well, Jen, do you know how many exports from China go to the United States? Just take like percentage-wise out of 100.
I think all I know is that our trade deficit's $330 billion.
Okay, so basically 14%. Okay, so we got 14% of Chinese goods are going to the United States, which obviously means that there's 86% that go everywhere around the world. Absolutely, China will be hurt. Like a trade war is absolutely going to hurt every single party involved, right? But there's a couple things I want people to understand. A lot of people in America, this is what I'm hearing, is that we don't need China's cheap crap, right? We don't need that. We can make it all in America. Well, it's absolutely baffling to have that thought, because China for 50 years has been building up this supply chain and this manufacturing prowess to get to the point of where it is today. And you think, what, with a snap of a finger, we're just going to be able to relocate factories here? We're going to be able to just do it all here in the United States? That's just not how our country's set up. We simply don't have the manufacturing capacity in the United States like we did. Now, I'm very fired up about this topic because I'm a United States citizen, Jen. I mean, I love the United States, and the problem with this is you look at our reputation on the world stage has absolutely plummeted the last 2 months since Donald Trump. This is a quote from Donald Trump and his Art of the Deal. The worst thing you can possibly do in a deal is seem desperate to make it. Well, who's looking desperate right now, right? Donald Trump is sounding like the desperate ex-girlfriend who's wanting to get back with her boyfriend and like frantically texting and calling. It's an absolute loss of face for the United States, and it's an absolute it just shows you how incompetent the United States president is right now.
And he's not wrong. Since we recorded that interview, tariffs were bumped up from 145 to 245% against China, and I imagine it was to send a message. But as a response, China responded in a completely unexpected way. Instead of matching the rates, China deployed something that will hurt America more, restricting rare earth mineral exports and putting dozens of US businesses on their unreliable entity list. To put simply, they're letting US companies like Apple fight their battles for them by pressuring their own government. And this perfectly follows a principle from the Art of War. Supreme excellence is breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. In fact, they've even gone far to announce that they're done retaliating and that any further US rate increases would be a joke that they would ignore. So it's clear that China is not backing down and instead increasingly looking to shift their battle to their advantages. And one way they're doing that is something that they've started hoarding decades before the conflict. Because if the US's advantage in currency, military, and market, China still holds the key to something critical: rare earths. Okay, hold on. What the hell is that, and who the hell cares about rocks? Well, these rare earths power everything from your smartphone to fighter jets, and increasingly to make electric cars to AI chips. So when you consider that and combine that with China's lead in manufacturing, the stakes become clear. Because if national security is on the line, whether it's a trade war or a real conflict, the advantage goes to the one who controls the resources and makes the goods. I'm curious, do you think this China's domination of rare earth minerals needed for everything from smartphones to fighter jets, how do you think China is currently utilizing that as leverage, as a weapon in this trade war?
China has over 95% control of these minerals and their refinement. That's the key point, is actually the refinement. Is China's the only country in the world that's doing this refining and has chosen to stop exporting them to the United States. Canada cannot stand up to the United States economically, right, because it's a tenth of the economy.
So dependent to it.
It's so dependent, right? Like, who has leverage? Does Mexico have leverage? No. Does Germany have leverage? No. So this is actually, I think, the biggest part of this trade war. But we're seeing where, again, China's in this. They're the one country in the world that can actually push back to the United States. So again, yesterday, massive news. China said, we're not buying any more Boeing airplanes. Okay. Well, look at the Boeing stock, right? Again, that stock has gone down because there's a duopoly, right? It's only Airbus and it's only Boeing. There's only two major airplane manufacturers. And what you have to remember is you have to go back to history, right? China suffered over 100 years of the century of humiliation with colonialism. We had the United States wanting to desperately take control over China. They know their own history, and they're very sensitive about this colonialism and this kind of bullying tactic.
And they're making that clear by knowing the enemy and themselves. Just like the Boeing move, they're now hitting back at American companies, from defense contractors to electric car makers like Tesla, by stopping exports on rare earth minerals they need. As one rare earth executive noted, they picked the exact thing that is crucial for the US economy. So even though they control the supply to the rare earths, can China really lean on this forever? Because while the US may have lost its manufacturing edge, there's one thing it still leads the world in: innovation. Who has the upper hand moving forward? Is it China with its manufacturing ecosystem or America with its innovation culture?
This all depends on what we see is the starting point. Because for China, for a while, most of their important advanced technologies have been stolen IP from the United States and other countries. For example, the German and Japanese high-speed rail train technology, that was taken when they did a joint venture back in the days. When you look at some of the latest fighter jet technologies, the 5th generation, a lot of that technology came from the American version. For me, I do not think that China is in a place to innovate, and I haven't seen anything so far that is a true innovation. They've been hyped up with a lot of things, right? DeepSeek, even with Red Note and things like that.
So I think one thing that's also interesting about having access to a lot of rare minerals and manufacturing is, let's say, all goes to shit and this does lead out to like an all-out war, right? That's when manufacturing becomes very important. In that instance, would the US be in trouble if something like that happens?
That's a real problem. And that's why I think the Trump administration is trying to reshore manufacturing, because they don't want that problem to be coming in the next few years or so when you're trying to, let's say, fight a war over Taiwan or something like that, and then you don't have enough ammo or you're not producing enough planes and things like that. That's also another issue.
And this helps explain why the US decided to launch this trade war to begin with. It's classic art of the deal, to protect the downside by reducing dependence on China for manufacturing and critical resources, and hope that the upside, better trade deals, will outweigh the downside. And as I've explained, it's a risky bet, but the US knows that China also has something to lose too. Rare earths are called the vitamins of the modern industry for a reason, yes, but they're a double-edged sword. If China stops exporting for too long, it doesn't just hurt the US, it cuts into their own profits too. Because at the end of the day, Apple also understands that money talks for China too. And that's why in the past, China has held back from a full-on shutdown. So now you can start seeing the picture of the balance of national security and true economic independence and why it's so tricky, because it doesn't go hand in hand. Real strategy means weighing both the risk and reward, and the longer the trade war drags on, the more risk there is for all. But in announcing these tariffs, the US may have overlooked one critical risk, because in any power game, you need strong allies to win. And if you're starting to alienate both your closest allies and rivals, who will back you when things fall apart?
European officials announced this week that the transatlantic partnership between the EU and the United States is dead. Vietnam just signed 45 new trade agreements. Japan hasn't had diplomatic meeting with China in over 6 years. Korea, Japan, China all met in Tokyo 2 weeks ago and said the three of us are now going to form a new alliance that we can work together to systematically combat Trump's trade tariffs. Germany's foreign minister said if we cannot get a deal with America, Germany will shift closer to China to circumnavigate Trump's tariff war. The one thing that you can't replace is trust. That's the thing that America has lost right now.
China isn't just reacting to US tariffs, they're using this moment to reshape global alliances. Following a key principle from the art of war, they're adapting to the circumstances and moving quick to offer themselves as alternatives to the US, even to America's closest allies. This didn't start yesterday. They've been planning it for decades. Just look at this shift from 2000 to 2024. China is actually now the top trade partner in the world for over 120 countries. So how did they do this? They did it through their Belt and Road Initiative, where China funds infrastructure in resource-rich areas like Africa in exchange for long-term access to their rare earth resources. So while the US is focused on building bombs and military bases, China built ports and pipelines. So the real question is, should the US be worried? Are you worried about China's growing influence in the world when it comes to having the #1 most amount of trade partners, manufacturing, access to rare minerals, especially in developing emerging countries?
I think China appears very strong on the outside, appears very cohesive. Even, for example, like organizations such as the BRICS, where China seems to be spearheading that effort, you see this BRICS movement for a few years now, and they have not realized anything concrete in those years. And I think if you look at some of the aspects, sure, China is very much friendly with countries in Africa or the Middle East, But I think this ultimately is just simply China trying to create this alternative version of the global order to that of the United States. What we've seen so far are simply numbers, but I don't think that they're really in a position to form an economic alliance, so to speak, against the United States.
If I may challenge you then, how about these reciprocal tariffs, right? I think there's been reports that this is damaging existing and maybe even future alliances on the US side.
Canada right now has a lot of fundamental problems. With Canada, there's more issues that are quite localized to the political party at the time. Mexico, I think, is a little less. They've not retaliated in that sense. It's 2 countries versus 90 plus countries not retaliating, and that tells you a lot.
I think it's easy to get reactive, but America still holds major advantages and alliances. It's easy to forget, but leading up to the tariffs, it's rallied key allies, NATO, the G7, the EU, around the more unified stance on China. Like how the EU has officially stated their move to de-risk themselves from Chinese dependence. And as David pointed out, many countries are still choosing to negotiate with the US instead of completely retaliating and pushing back. In a world where money and power talks, it shows that the US's brand as having the world's largest military and economy still carries tremendous weight. But here's the truth, most countries don't want to pick sides. They'd rather work with both China and the US, not just one. But if this continues to escalate, lines will start getting drawn. And as history shows, when tensions rise, things escalate fast. And in the end, the side that's better prepared usually wins. But maybe it's not just about diplomacy or resources, because in any negotiation or power struggle, the side that has less to lose and can play the longest game almost always comes out on top. So the real question is, which culture is built to play the longer game? One thing that America's very focused on is innovation, and the soul of America that a lot of people like to say is stock market growth. Do you think this could also stifle the potentially long-term gain that could happen during a trade war? Whereas with China, since they have such a stricter control over the government as well as the big businesses there, would there be an advantage of being able to play the longer game?
So in that sense, you could say that policy planning wise, definitely China thinks along ahead. But you also have to consider where things are in the stock market. Companies lost trillions of dollars in one day, but things are back, right? These dips happen and they go back. But if you say that China is somehow going to beat the United States in a free market game, that's something not going to happen.
Some point to China's 10,000-year culture versus America's around 250-year culture to suggest that China has a long-term advantage. How does America's different cultural approach to time and planning affect this competition?
We need to not look at China as a 5,000 or 10,000-year civilization today. The reason is many of that traditional the aspects were destroyed in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution. China today is a very materialistic country that is hyper-focused on winning the money war. And so, in fact, I view China and the United States as on the same level when it comes to how the world is run today. I think whether or not America needs its history to look at if it can win a modern culture war or a modern economic war against China, I think it's less important, because the fundamental idea of America is the fact that they want to be a place where people can realize their dreams, and it's something that many people agree with. That's why they want to come to America. But you don't see that happening in China. You don't see people immigrating to China, or at least Americans are not immigrating to China.
As someone who is American and Canadian, but also lived in China, I think you're very much well qualified to speak on this. And you've also suggested that China plays the long game versus America with its, stock market and quarter focused and quick wins. How realistic is that, though, when you consider that China's kind of revolution and big shift that we see today only happened 50 years ago?
You brought up a good point, right? It's really been the last 50 years that China has really emerged and really become this incredible superpower. What I love about China is that every 5 years they have the 5-year plan, okay? And the government comes out and says, look, for the next 5 years, these are the goals of the country. We saw 2015, Xi Jinping said, look, we're going to have this Made in China 2025 initiative. Over the next 10 years, we're going to be shifting towards this high-end manufacturing, right? What you're seeing right now is, look at the EV industry, right? China is the dominant player in the EV industry. There's not another country in the world, Jen, that can produce an electric vehicle battery except China.
So applying kind of like these kind of cultural standards and how that translates into policy, do you see this being applied in who wins out in the trade war?
You're going to see a very fragmented relationship between the United States and China, but you're going to see a very fragmented relationship between the United States and every country. There's not a country in the world right now that is ecstatic with what Donald Trump is doing. Who says, we have a trade surplus, we have a trade deficit. We need to change that. Vietnam is ripping us off. No, it's not. The reason why there's that trade difference is that Vietnam doesn't have the money to buy all of these iPhones and Teslas and everything. So of course there's going to be a difference in trade. But also you want to have this trade deficit because that requires countries to use the US dollar to buy your goods, which at the end of the day is what keeps the United States dollar the world reserve currency. You can't have both. They contradict each other.
And that's when I realized something. Yes, Chinese and American culture are different. We see it in how they use their power, but maybe we're not really as different as we think. And instead, the fight is happening because we become too similar. Both are locked in on winning the tech and AI race. Both blend capitalism with nationalism, just in different ways. And both are racing towards a strong military and economy because these are two rivals that want the exact same thing. But in this case, the ultimate prize isn't just money or resources. It's the power to write the rules that the rest of the world has to follow. The good news for now is that neither side wants to turn this into a real conflict, but that could change any moment. And while these global powers play their games, it's easy to feel like spectators to history. But I don't think you have that luxury. The truth is, trade wars are sold as fights for fairness, but really, they're fought over our jobs, our products, and our futures. You can't just watch from the sidelines. We're all part of the rope in the tug of war for power. And this sounds depressing, but I think it's an opportunity. Look, at the end of the day, you and I can't change these systems, but we can control our focus. Because when systems break, new opportunities open. And the more you learn how power moves, the better you can spot the ripple effects before anyone else. Because whether it's power through leverage or power through strategy, the one consistency is that the one who always wins are the ones that can adapt to the rules of the game. And the ones who will lose will be the ones watching as history unfolds. So the question is, what will you do? And so if you want to become smarter about money and power, then check out my free newsletter, The Money Trails, where I write about the power behind today's issues in business, politics, and culture. Or if you prefer to just watch this next video, click here to find out how the US became so good at soft power.